And now, without further ado, we're going to call up Dr. Mark Melnik, who runs the economic and public policy at the Donahue Institute, has a team of 23 staff researching public policy issues and economic development, housing, and workforce development. Well, I'm just going to call him up.
Yeah.
I don't need to say anything else about him, and you've been waiting to hear from him. So,
Who was here last year for this? All right, good. It's good to know which jokes can be recycled and which can't. It's always exciting when I show up somewhere and they're all new. It's like, yes. I run the Economic and Public Policy Research Group at the UMass Donahue Institute. The Donahue Institute operates as a kind of public service and economic development arm of the UMass Amherst campus and touches a lot of different aspects of economic and civic and social life around the Commonwealth, New England, and even through some national programs. The group that I lead is probably the most well-known aspect of the Donahue Institute because we do a lot of applied public policy research for state government, municipal government, regional planning agencies, and so on. For example, we worked on the most recent statewide housing plan for Massachusetts. We worked on a housing study for Greater Springfield as well, and we do other things around economic impact assessments, economic development planning, and so on. We also produce a journal twice a year called Mass Benchmarks. Mass Benchmarks has actually 10 products that come out every year. We have 4 board notes where a bunch of economists in Massachusetts get together and talk about the economy and kind of in real time, hey, what's up? And then 4 times a year, we do an index release that focuses on how the mass economy is growing relative to the nation. And then that journal comes out twice a year that talks about what's going on in the state economy as well. All of that work informs what I affectionately refer to as the roadshow, where I go out and talk with different groups about the things that we're seeing in the state and national economy. Since last year when I saw you guys, a lot has happened. And the last couple of years have been particularly interesting with change in administration, the kind of post-COVID economic recovery and then slowdown. And then obviously a number of the external issues that are influencing the economy, most notably now the war in Iran. The way we've renamed this in talking about the state economy right now is uneven growth and challenging headwinds. And I'll go through a number of things that we see that are really interesting in the state and national economy. One highlight, though, I'll dwell on it a little bit more later, is we've had this kind of drumbeat of this recession that's coming, this vibe session around how the economy doesn't feel like it's doing super well. Data come out that kind of conflict with that. We've seen a lot of economic growth nationally and in the state without a lot of job growth. And then recently we've seen some gains in jobs. So I'm going to talk about a number of these things as we get going. In terms of takeaways, and this is a terrible room for the slide deck, but you guys are obviously free to share this with folks who are here. But some of the things that I'll talk about. Income inequality. Massachusetts has the second highest per capita income in the nation. But when you dig in on that a little bit, we see huge disparities in the economic experience in the state, depending on where you live in Massachusetts, as your educational attainment and by race. We've noticed, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, that we've been seeing a fair amount of economic growth and economic activity without a lot of job gains. And in particular, employment in Massachusetts has been really stagnant over the last 3 years. But at the same time, GDP continues to expand and actually is either keeping pace with the nation or has been ahead of the nation in a few places. And part of that is because of the makeup of industries that we do have. They tend to be highly productive, higher wage sectors of the economy. So while employment has been kind of flat, we've been seeing activity has been growing. Industry strength, and that relates to some of the industry strengths that we have, particularly around knowledge and innovation. That said, some of the shifts in federal policy have really put some of these aspects of our economy at risk, especially around things like research and development and the federal research dollars that go into our colleges and universities and the hospitals. Labor force challenges. Anybody who was here last year, I dwelled on this a bit, and is always a part of my roadshow, is that we're an aging state. People who do the kind of work that I do, we've been talking for about 20 years about this coming silver tsunami as baby boomers reach into retirement ages and older Gen Xers and what that's going to mean for our labor force. That conversation really chilled for a while because of COVID. We paused the world for 2 years, but one thing that definitely happened is we kept getting older. And we're starting to see one of these ramifications coming around where labor force growth in our state is really stagnated, even though population has gained a bit. In terms of the housing market, despite high price levels in Massachusetts, the state and the nation experienced pretty similar challenges in terms of cost burden. But we've really fallen behind the U.S. on housing permitting and construction in general, so this lack of supply, and I have a few slides on that. And I think for this year's program, Coleman is going to be touching on some things around housing policy as well. So this next graphic I have here is what we call Massachusetts at a glance. I like this for just kind of stage setting about some of the things that we know are going on in the state economy. So first, our unemployment rate's about 4.5%. That's the 17th highest in the nation, which has been really rare standing in this space. When I talk about things that are going on in the mass economy, we generally have had one of the lower unemployment rates in the nation. And sometimes when our unemployment rate it seems a little high, it's also because we have high labor force participation rates. So a lot of people participating in the economy. But we're actually above the US average right now. We've definitely been spoiled over the last several years by having historically low unemployment, especially post-COVID. Where we had unemployment rates below 4% for a good stretch of time. Economists typically think of full employment as anything below 5%. We've been below 5% for a pretty long time. That said, still one of the higher ones in the nation. The second measure I have there is what's called U6. These are folks who are, it's an additive thing to unemployment. It's both folks who are unemployed, but people who but it includes people who are part-time but would like to work full-time. So your U6 unemployment rate's always a little bit higher than the traditional measure of unemployment. But I like looking at this because I think it also highlights some about what's been going on in the economy, broadly speaking. In the Great Recession, for example, we saw the traditional unemployment rate coming down, but the U6 staying persistently high. And that's when you might recall people talking about a jobless recovery during the Great Recession. You know, with the COVID crisis, U6 came down pretty quickly. We're right in the middle of the pack right now, but it's been kind of stagnating there at that 7.6 level. Population change highlights a number of interesting things that have been happening in the state over the last few years. Over the last 5 years, Massachusetts' population has grown about 1.7%. But for those of you who have been kind of tracking these things in the news at all, this has been kind of rickshawing a little bit. Immediately when the 2020 census came out, Massachusetts' population growth was right in line with the U.S. Between the 2010 and 2020 census, we grew 7.4%. And then COVID happened, and we had 2 years in a row of negative population change in Massachusetts. So there's a ton of news stories about like Massachusetts is losing residents, we're losing residents. And then after those initial 2 years, we saw population recover. And part of this was patterns in COVID. Part of this was some issues in immigration. If I was giving this presentation to you guys 3 years ago, we'd have been talking about like Massa's losing population. Right now we have been gaining, but it's been slight. And then in terms of job growth over the last year, we've had basically no job growth, actually a modest decline in job growth over the last year. But so far this calendar year, Massachusetts has seen positive changes in total jobs in the state, which is great to see. A couple other demographic things. 18.7% of Massachusetts is foreign-born. That's 6th highest in the nation. The economic story in Massachusetts is very much an immigrant story. 80% of the labor force growth in Massachusetts since 1990 has been because of foreign-born labor. And a lot of the population gains that we've seen in Massachusetts over the last few decades has been because of the gains in immigration, which now with changes in federal policy related to the Trump administration, I'm going to show you guys some new data on what's been happening in immigration in the last year or two. It does raise some concerns about our long-term labor force size in the state because we've really relied on immigrants to grow our economy for a while. 9.7% of Massachusetts is below poverty. That's the 9th lowest in the nation. But the poverty rate is a really imprecise way or blunt way of thinking about relative economic deprivation. The poverty line is the same no matter where you are in the country, and it does not take into account cost of living. So we know there's a lot of folks in Massachusetts who are living in poverty-like conditions, but are not technically in poverty and not eligible for some of the federal programs that would be, or there would be challenges in getting access to some of the federal programs intended for people in poverty. But our cost of living makes making ends meet difficult. The median age in the state is 40, so that's 17th oldest in the nation, and we have the most well-educated population in the country, with nearly half of Massachusetts residents 25 or over having a college degree. This next graphic looks at the per capita income by state. I mentioned a little bit before about us having one of the highest per capita incomes in the country. We're always jockeying with Connecticut. Right now we're around 98,000 per capita, ranking a second in the nation and 30% above the national average. But the income differences are stark when you compare different demographic groups, geographic groups, and regions. This here is a slightly different measure of income, but this looks at median household income by race in Massachusetts. So the median household income is $105,000, but when we look by different racial groups in the state, we see a big difference between white at $113,000 median household income, for Asian, $140,000, but then compared to, say, Black at $74,000 and Hispanic at $69,000. So big differences racially, and there's clearly a relationship between that and educational attainment. So this graphic here looks at disparities in educational attainment by race, which I think reflects some of the differences that we see in income. So here's that percent of the population with a college degree in red for Massachusetts, and the yellow is for the US. So 48% of Massachusetts has a college degree, 37% of the US has a college degree. But when we look at our individual groups, how it looks, for whites in Massachusetts, it's 52%. For Asian, it's nearly it's over 2/3. And then for Black, 32%, and Hispanic, 22%. So while every racial group in Massachusetts has higher educational attainment than that same group nationally, we have big differences when we look within in Massachusetts. And then geographically, so I found this super interesting because I end up doing talks all over the state. I'm also on an economic development task force for the new chancellor for UMass Amherst. And when I do these talks in the aggregate, and they'll say, well, Massachusetts has the highest per capita income or the second highest per capita income, we deconstructed that to say, like, well, how does this look different depending on where you are in the state? So this takes different regions of Massachusetts and plots what the per capita income is by region. So Greater Boston is number one, leads with where the per capita income is $10,000 above the state's, which is, again, the second highest in the country. Cape and the Islands is just a smidge under 100,000, and not surprising when we think about particularly like Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and what incomes might look like there. There's our Massachusetts average. But then as you start going down, you see big differences where, okay, here's Southeast, 78,000 per capita, US 73,000. Berkshire's below the US at 72,000. Central Mass, 72,000. Pioneer Valley, home of UMass, per capita income, 66,000, right? So when I give this talk in Western Mass, I say, hey, you live in the richest state in the country. It's like, well, driven by the big city that's 3 hours east of here. And so the different parts of the state seeing this quite differently. I mentioned cost of living before. This graphic, I think, is a fun way of just kind of looking at cost of living. This is the regional price parity for all states. The US is the average at 100, and then each state has a score, basically. And the punchline here is that if you're brown or orange, that's a state that is above the national average in terms of prices. And if you're in blue, then you're below the average. The bluer, the more below, the darker, the more above. So not surprisingly, California's high, the northeastern part of the US high. I grew up in the Midwest, which some of you guys might recall, but so that's lower. And one of the fun stories, I think I maybe told this group, but I bought my house in Natick in 2018, and I'm from Northeast Ohio, and that was the same year that Kyrie Irving got traded from the Cavs to the Celtics, and a buddy of mine sent me Kyrie's house listing in Cleveland, and it was for less than the house I bought in Natick. So this is one of those things that kind of demonstrate that, right? Let's get in jobs in the economy. I mentioned unemployment before. This plots the change in unemployment for Massachusetts and the US dating back to the mid-70s. Just for orientation, Massachusetts is the red, US is the yellow. We have these vertical gray bars. Each one of those gray bars is a recession. The thickness of the gray bar is how long that recession took place. So the Great Recession, as you guys would all recall, that's why it really stands out. It was a long recession. The COVID recession was actually quite short. Not surprisingly, Massachusetts moves in concert with the US. We're a smaller part of a bigger thing. I think one of the reasons why I like showing this is kind of like where we separated from the US in the post-Great Recession recovery. We recovered faster and had a pretty historically low unemployment rate for a long stretch of time. COVID, it blows up again. And then we've been kind of intertwined with the US over the last couple of years and been a little bit elevated relative to the US. I mentioned with per capita income that our mix of industries and having some high wage industries dictates a bit about why we see both higher per capita income, but then also why the GDP looks a bit different in Massachusetts when you take into account like the sluggish job growth. This graphic here looks at the percentage of jobs in Massachusetts by industry and compares it to the US. Again, Mass is in the red, US is the yellow. And I think the main things I'd like to highlight here is that we have about 20% of our jobs are in healthcare. That's the largest industry nationally, even at 16%, but it's elevated here. We have a lot of elite teaching hospitals. We also have an older population, which I think is driving some of the job gains that we're seeing in healthcare. Education is our second largest industry, makes up 10% of our jobs, which is somewhat similar to the US. But the part I love drawing attention to is professional, scientific, and technical services. 10% of our jobs are in this industry, only 7% nationally. This is the highest wage industry in our state. It's a terribly named one because at times it's hard to picture what it is, but it includes a lot of things like advanced consulting services, engineering firms, research and development. That's all kind of covered inside of professional and technical services. Has been a big driver for our state economy. I mentioned mass benchmarks before, and we create a number of products. One of the things is the index release where we compare the change in economic activity in Massachusetts to the US. This here looks at changes in gross regional product. So, for the country, gross domestic product, or for the state, we would refer to as gross state product. One of the things that I wanted to call attention to is that, we've really had sluggish job gains in the state, but we've seen a fair amount of economic growth. So I think last time I saw you guys would have been somewhere in this Q2 period of 2025. And so technically a recession is when you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic activity. So in Q1 of 2025, we were halfway there, right? We had that negative quarter. That quarter is January to March. Come early April, that's when Liberation Day happened, and the announcements about the tariffs on everybody, including penguins in Australia. And I was absolutely certain that here comes the recession, because this is going to be the downwind that we needed for the economy to actually slow down. And what happened was the economy actually bounces back almost immediately after. Now, the tariff policy has been a moving target the entire time. The Trump administration continues to kind of use it as a negotiating tactic with different countries. And fine, Liberation Day wasn't quite what it was billed as. But I think what has been important is just the level of resiliency we've been seeing in the economy, where post-COVID, there was like, a lot of doom and gloom about the economy, but it came back pretty quick. And then here over the last couple of years, that even with some of the challenges and even in the Biden administration, where there's a lot of negativity about the economy, and now the early part of Trump, the economy continues to be productive. For Massachusetts, even with sluggish job growth, we've exceeded the US on productivity in 4 out of the last 5 quarters. Now, I mentioned that we've had very little job gain in Massachusetts over the last couple of years. This graphic was an attempt at trying to pinpoint a little bit of where the slowdown occurs. So we have each of the last several years. The first half of the year, January and June, are the darker red, and the pink is that July through December. We kind of have this bounce back period for jobs in 2021. This is immediately after the recession, a lot of job gains in both halves of the year. First half of 2022 kind of stays on pace a bit, and then it really starts to slow down, right? And then basically from the back half of 2023, we have no job gains. 2024 is in the aggregate, nothing. And then 2025 is a bit negative. And then in 2026, we're up about 10,000 jobs so far. which is great. But for much of the last couple of years, we've seen almost nothing happening in terms of job gains. Over the last year over year, so far this calendar year, we're up about 10,000. I showed you that graphic at the beginning where we were like basically zero jobs over the last calendar year. Here's where some of those changes have occurred though, right? We've seen healthcare and social assistance with a good bounce in total employment, transportation and warehousing. Construction's a bit down in here, but has been a big driver of job gains this calendar year. So a lot of that 10,000 that I noted before was actually in construction, and it's been a lot of infrastructure-based construction. So there's some in housing and office space, but a lot of it is in more like civil engineering and that kind of stuff. But I think what's really important here has been the job decline in professional and technical services. Most of our job recovery post-COVID was in professional and technical services. And what we found over the last couple of years is that industry has really slowed down a ton. You guys, if you track any of the business section in the Globe or whatever, there's probably that monthly story that they run about the lab space that was built in whatever city and hasn't been occupied yet. I think there was a little bit of speculative build out that was happening post-COVID because of the gains that industry was having, and it's kind of stalled out. But we've also seen a lot of venture capital moving away from the life sciences and moving towards things like AI. So we've seen a huge jump in the last 18 months in venture capital activity in California. And so Massachusetts, while we have some of that occurring here, California and the Bay Area in particular have been big leaders in that space. So I think it's part of the headwinds that our professional and technical services are facing. And then add to that the federal moving targets as it's been around the NIH and NSF funding that usually go to our colleges and universities, right? That is an important feeder into the professional and technical services. A lot of the job change I was talking about for Massachusetts sounds relatively negative, but I think what's important to plot is that we're actually pretty similar to a lot of states right now. Over the last year, Massachusetts were just down a tick, but the US is only up 0.2%. So we look, not wildly dissimilar from the nation. The blue that you see here are what we call competitor states, and the green here are the other New England states. So the competitor states were defined in a study we had done earlier this year, and I'm going to reference it in a few slides, measuring and comparing the R&D ecosystem in Massachusetts to other places. The competitor states were other states that had a similar profile as Massachusetts with knowledge-based sectors of the economy and investment and research. Examples of that: North Carolina, Texas, Pennsylvania, California. And we're kind of smack dab in the middle of that group, and we're a bit ahead of the other New England states, but none of the New England states are doing all that great right now. So while the job change in Massachusetts has been sluggish, it's been sluggish in a lot of places. Now, one of the things that got us thinking at the Donahue Institute was, man, it's really interesting how we're growing no jobs, but we keep seeing this change in gross domestic product. What do we think about that, right? So we decided to plot, index GDP and job change in Massachusetts going back to 2001 and kind of look at how GDP has changed relative to jobs. And what we see is that while that period of like more recent years where we're like, man, we've been seeing a lot of this GDP going up and the job's not doing anything. But if you look backward over the last 26 years, it's a trend that's been with us for a while. But what's interesting is that it seems like each economic crisis that you run into, the separation between GDP and jobs gets a little bit more, exacerbates a bit. So here during the dot-com bust, we see employment and jobs kind of separate a bit. We see it again here in the recovery or the crisis with the Great Recession and the recovery, and then again with COVID. Anyway, something really interesting to continue to track, but this way in which GDP and jobs don't always necessarily move together. I mean, they do move together in a sense. They are both pointing in a positive direction, but the degree to which is not intertwined to the extent that we kind of expect it to see. As you think about economic innovation, whether it's AI or the use of the internet or all these different things, it's always intended to wring out more productivity with fewer people. And we see that in some of the ways in which GDP and jobs move. I mentioned R&D a bit ago, and this is from that report I referenced, the R&D ecosystem study. Around this time last year, we were working on a project with the governor's office where she was going to announce this thing called the DRIVE initiative, where the state was going to put some money towards backfilling lost federal research dollars for colleges and universities and hospitals to try to keep the R&D system moving, right? And so we did an economic impact on that. But one of the things I kind of pushed back on at the time is like, we're happy to do an economic impact on the importance of the NIH and NSF dollars that come into the state. But that's a very limited way of thinking about R&D, because that's talking about basic research that occurs at a college and university or at a hospital. But the things that happen in the private sector are not picked up in that. What happens in the private sector is that some great idea develops, gets better, and then 10 or 15 years after that, you end up seeing something happening in the private sector, right? And I wanted to better articulate that ecosystem, that nexus of the public sector, the money from the federal government going into nonprofits and the hospitals and the universities, but what it means to the private sector, right? So then okay, Mark, okay. So you do that study too. Okay, so we did the first one. This one we released in March, but we brought together those elements of the parts of colleges and universities that are engaged in research and development. So not the philosophy professors, not the administrative staff, but the people who actually are getting money from NIH and those activities, as well as the different parts in the private sector, either the research itself or those things that are related. For example, Central Massachusetts has a really robust pharmaceutical chemical manufacturing sector, right? That's tied to our R&D, but it's not R&D. So in any case, Massachusetts stands out far and above the US in terms of research and development jobs in our ecosystem, where per 1,000 residents, we have 52.4 jobs in R&D. Compared to about 25 in the US, so more than twice what the average is in the US. And when we compare it to our competitor states, we're still far and above places like Washington, California, Maryland. That study that we did on the R&D ecosystem, one of the fun pieces for us was we use a model called IMPLAN, industry matrix that takes into account the business-to-business spending and consumer spending, so that it can estimate both the direct and spin-off effects in the broader economy, right? So when we take that into account, the business-to-business and the consumer spending that's generated from R&D, first, the direct jobs in the state is about 376,000 jobs in the state. But when you take into account the business-to-business spending and the consumer spending, it's over 1 million total jobs in Massachusetts that are either employed in R&D or directly supported by R&D. That makes up 28% of the Massachusetts economy. That's bigger than the economies of Maine and Vermont combined. And that's what that ecosystem does for us. 28% of the employment, 28% of the state economy, but 40% of the wages in the state are supported or generated by or supported from R&D. In part because R&D has really high wages and spends money in all these different spots, right? So it's a huge piece of our economy. And that was one of the things that I really wanted to highlight when we were doing this work, is that irrespective of federal policy from the Trump administration or whoever follows, the important thing is, one of the things that's important is highlighting how this industry is competitive and stays competitive, because there's a number of things that can influence that. It can be the federal funding, but it can also be cost of living, right? It can also be housing. It could be all the different things that make an area less competitive for a workforce. And that's what some of the stuff that we highlight in the work we did there. All right, graying of the labor force. This graphic is my favorite we do at the Donahue Institute. You guys would have saw something like this last year. But these are the different parts of population change in the state. Let me walk through it real quick. The red line are our births, and the pink line are our deaths, and the broken black line here is the natural increase. So that's just the difference between the two. So We have more births than deaths in Massachusetts, but that delta is shrinking. Part of this is because we're an aging state. Part of it is because we have a very well-educated population, well-educated female population, high labor force participation rates for women, leads to later family formation, smaller household sizes. But that's the difference on natural increase. So very modest. There are several states in the country where they actually have a negative natural increase right now. Maine being one, Vermont another. So where we see states that are old and don't attract a lot of immigrants in particular, we see the more deaths than births. You also see COVID happening here too, where the death kind of comes up and the birth kind of comes down. And in those kind of crises will do that. The next piece of population changes are domestic migration. Massachusetts historically has been a net loser on domestic migration. That is people who live in Massachusetts and move to another state. You might recall a couple years ago, the globe lost its mind probably in 2022, where Massachusetts was losing all these folks who were here and then moved to another state. I remember at the time advising folks in the governor's office being like, well, I don't think that's durable, but I do think there's signal and noise issues here. Any individual year can be noise. The signal is that for the last 25 years, we've been net losers on domestic migration, right? But the level of which kind of normalized after the pandemic. So the thing that's always counteracted that population loss for us has been international migration. And that's this blue line that we see here. So what's interesting, so I talked about the importance of immigrants on the mass population. Here, 2016, new Trump administration, and we see immigration go down during the Trump years. Some of that's policy, some of that's rhetoric, but most importantly, it's COVID. COVID slows down immigration to basically a trickle. In the Biden administration and the border crisis that we saw after COVID, we saw this dramatic increase in the number of immigrants that were in Massachusetts and in the nation. I think when I would have been given this presentation to you guys before, this would have actually jumped up even more because the Census Bureau used a really crude method for estimating border crisis immigrants and where they were putting them around the U.S. And I remember a different policy conversation with folks in the state where they were like, hey, we had our biggest single year increase in total population. And I was like, that's a methods thing that happened. And I don't think that's actually real. That number did come down a bit, but really, what really brought the number down was the beginning of the new Trump administration, right? So we basically had half as much immigration last year than we had the previous couple of years. These data always come out in December. So I'm looking forward to seeing what 2 years of the Trump data is going to do. But this big change in the amount of immigration that we're seeing in the state. International immigration has been much more important to Massachusetts just in terms of growing our population than even the nation. This is another indexing comparing international migration rates for the U.S. and Massachusetts. So you could see this kind of, we were ahead of the U.S. and then this kind of acute jump up and then this sudden drop down. So we're seeing a lot of that ramifications here. Now, immigrants are really important, as I've mentioned in a few different places, to growing our workforce. And here's one example why. Here is the dark red is the age profile of the native-born population in Massachusetts. And the pink is the age profile of the foreign-born in Massachusetts. So what's really interesting here is the kind of perfect normal curve that we see out of the foreign-born population, and in particular, that concentration of that population within prime working age groups, right? And we actually see very few children who are foreign-born, but when these folks have kids, they're native-born, right? So probably if they're born here, right? So the importance of the foreign-born and kind of just driving our labor force size. Now, I mentioned how Massachusetts has a positive natural increase, and though it's been coming down, but Massachusetts has 14 counties in it, and 7 of our counties have a negative natural increase, and 7 of our counties have a positive natural increase. So the positive natural increase counties are the blue, and the negative are the brownish and orangish. So it's not a stunner when you look at this and say like, oh yeah, Barnstable County is going to have more deaths than births. Franklin County, the Berkshires, all of Pioneer Valley. These are places, generally speaking, that do not attract a lot of immigrants and don't have a lot of young workers. So there you have more deaths than births. Talking about the age profile a bit more, on the left is the age pyramid for Massachusetts in 2020. And on the right is the age pyramid for Massachusetts based on the population projections we produce at the UMass Donahue Institute. We actually do them for all the cities and towns in Massachusetts. If you're curious, you can feel free to go check them out. We use a component change model where we basically age people and kill them off, and they have babies, but it's all based on statistically like where you are in your life cycle. So what we see here is that our age pyramid in 2020 starts turning into a rectangle by 2050, where we have this larger concentration of folks in the oldest age cohorts, and then and I think it's also interesting how many more old women we have than guys. The comedian Bill Burr has that. His latest stand-up special is the Drop Dead years, about how like from 55 to 65 is just like when men will drop dead, because women don't do that, but guys do, right? but those are but demographically speaking, we see just that higher concentration of older folks in the state out to 2050. And what that means for our labor force long term, though, is that for Massachusetts, our labor force has really not grown over the last year. It's actually shrunk a little bit, even though our population's a bit higher, because we see more folks moving into the retirement ages, right? So this is just tracking that trend line, the different Mays over the last 8 years. So in May 2019, we had about 3.8 million workers in the state. COVID happens. We had this dramatic decline in the total number of workers in the state. A lot of people left the labor force. It's back when people were referring to this as a C-session. Female labor force participation dropped a ton. And you can kind of date when schools reopen again on that. And then what we see is our labor force finally grows back up before its pre-pandemic level and then starts slipping back, right? And again, a function of age. Now, I mentioned that population projection before. We took the population projections that we do at the Donahue Institute and then applied current day labor force participation rate to see what happens to the state's workforce over a longer timeline. So between 2000 and 2025, the state's labor force grew about 18%. But if you were to take current day labor force participation rates and apply it to that population projection that we did for the state, we actually show that the state's labor force is actually going to shrink by about 2% over the next 25 years. And if you do this regionally, some parts of the state, it really shrinks. Places like Franklin County, I've done a bunch of talks in the Fitchburg-Leominster area. That's an older part of the state, and really is not a place that's really done a great job attracting young folks and immigrants. So that labor force really starts to shrink. So this ends up being a economic competitiveness issue that kind of budding between age change and immigration. More on immigration. Mass immigrants mainly live in Greater Boston with some clusters in the Pioneer Valley. So this just touches on that a bit here, where we see a lot of that immigration here and those same states where we actually see positive natural increase. In terms of racial dynamics, though, it's interesting because we don't have a lot of immigrants out in the western part of the state, but both Holyoke and Springfield have really large Puerto Rican populations. But they're not, obviously they don't count as foreign born. Okay, a couple things on housing trends. Massachusetts renters and homeowners are more likely to be cost burdened than the nation, although the percentages are modest in difference. About half of all renters in Massachusetts, over half, are cost burdened. Cost burdened by Census Bureau definition is folks who are spending 30% or more of their income on housing. Owners, it's about a third. And then owners without a mortgage, it's 20%. I think this crowd would be familiar with this, but that number ends up being as elevated as it is because you're talking about folks who they have their taxes and their utilities and things like that. They're living most likely on a fixed income. The cost burden issues across, and then 1 in 4. Okay, this is extreme housing cost burden. These are households that are spending 50% or more of their income on housing. So a quarter of all renters, 12% of owners. So in terms of that renter profile and that cost issue really intersects with a number of other demographic issues. This graphic here looks at ownership and owners and renters by race. So in Massachusetts, 62% of units are owned, 38% are rented, 70% of white households own their home. 61% of Asian, but then a big difference for the Hispanic and Black communities. And I think, as you guys just saw, housing cost burden is much higher for renters, and that really creates a lot of challenges in terms of like saving to buy a home later and that kind of stuff, especially for younger adults. But we see this intersection with race very clearly. Housing inflation has remained high since the pandemic, though Greater Boston's actually come down a bit. This here is the Northeast, is the yellow, the United States is the red, and Greater Boston, Metro Boston is the gray. So housing inflation has actually come down a little bit in Greater Boston, but keep in mind also the base was quite a bit higher too. So this is just how much the year over year change has been. But we're seeing here at least housing inflation has kind of come down a little bit, but these data are traditionally pretty noisy. Massachusetts is a big lagger in terms of housing production. This graphic here looks at the permitting per 1,000 residents. Massachusetts ranks in the bottom 5. The U.S. rate is 4.2%. We're at 1.7, and obviously down towards the back end. And what I think has been really interesting in thinking about underproduction of housing in Massachusetts has been how long that problem has been the case. Our political leadership in the state has spent much of the last 10 years, 20 years talking about needing to produce more housing. If you didn't see this and you're like, oh, look, we're doing better, compared to where we were in, say, like 2009 or whatever, in this gentle increase in the amount of permitted units. But when you look back over a 60-year time horizon, you see like, wow, we really have underproduced housing for a long period of time. And what I think is also interesting is the different types of housing. So that darker red is the housing permits for 1 to 4 unit housing, and then the pink is the 5+ units. These are measurements of individual units. It's interesting to see how that profile went from more multi-unit housing construction to more smaller unit, and then recently kind of shifting back again. But we've really underproduced for a long time. So just highlights, state economies had a mixed performance post-pandemic with a surge in hiring immediately after COVID, but then a real slowdown. Regardless, GDP has been doing pretty well. Federal policy continues to create some noise in how we're thinking about the state economy, both whether it's around inflation, immigration, and the workforce, as well as the funding for federal research. But long term, the aging profile of our state is something that we really need to be focusing on, especially with any reduction to international immigration, which has been a really important part of how we've grown our workforce, which is one of the reasons I often press when I talk about this. One is immigration is important contributors. Second is how do we increase labor force participation for people who are here, because for each demographic group, hey, if you can just bring it up 3, 4, 5%, you create more workers that way.
Brief introduction, because we've been waiting to hear from him. Government relations and public affairs expert, a mass lobbyist, and an associate staff at the Massachusetts Association of Realtors. Come on up.
Awesome.
And I'm going to steal it for 1 second. The only reason why I'm doing it, thank you for the introduction, is because I know Coleman and I know the MAR team, the legal team specifically, do not ever want to take personal credit for what has happened ever, and no matter what they do. But a huge round of applause goes to Coleman for what the MAR staff did on rent controls. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you with that. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today about, one of the defining economic and social challenges facing Massachusetts, that is housing. I was going to talk about a potential ballot question, rent control. I've been talking to many of our members about this, and we've been really trying to raise, the awareness on this. For a little, bit of feedback, if you haven't read the news in the past 10 months, it would have created the most restrictive form of rent control in the entire country, limiting rental increases to, basically 2 to 3% every single year. There would have been no appeals process, there would have been no vacancy decontrol, and no ability to raise rent if, increases in taxes or property insurance came through. And then more than that, baseline rents would have technically been set back in January of this year. So MAR joined forces last year with our industry partners to launch a campaign aimed at defeating this ballot question that was Housing for Massachusetts. Since launching, we secured the endorsement of over 130 municipal leaders, business associations, and elected officials. And we just finished running 5 weeks of ads on TV, streaming, and social media. Because of this work, and more than 4 months before voters even went to the polls, our internal polling was showing that support for rent control was dropping drastically. Rent control is one of the few policies within housing where the evidence is very clear. It discourages new investment, drives away private investment, reduces housing supply, and ultimately harms renters, homeowners, and communities. The Supreme Judicial Court threw out the ballot question because it found that it was unconstitutional because it was going to give preferential treatment to religious facilities. Within the Massachusetts Constitution, you can't have religion be part of a ballot question, and this proposal said that religious facilities were going to be exempt from rent control. So we challenged this before the Supreme Judicial Court back in, I think, April, or we originally filed back in February. Several small property owners and landlords, one of them was an MAR member from Pioneer Valley, were part of this. While this verdict kills rent control for 2026 pretty much, we are still facing a serious housing affordability challenge in Massachusetts, and rent control proponents will be loud advocates. We're already thinking about the ways that we can, be loud and, out front on housing affordability to try to get ahead of rent control. There are many things, and I'm going to talk about several, very niched ones, but there are a lot of things that we can do, as real estate professionals that, will help with Massachusetts affordability challenge that is not rent control. So there is the fear that they'll come back in 2020. The legislative session kicks off again in January of 2027, and will be they fear that they come back in 2028. But that's why we need to all come together and really be out front on housing affordability, so that rent control isn't the solution people are asking for. While these challenges facing renters are significant, rent control does not address the underlying problem. At MAR, we hear from members every day, home buyers, renters, and property owners who are all experiencing the consequences of a market that is simply not producing enough homes. The ripple effects are kind of showing up in every corner, in every stage of life. Young people are delaying, homeownership or leaving the state altogether. Employers are struggling to attain and attract workers. Families are finding it harder to stay in the communities where they grew up. Seniors are finding it fewer options to, downsize and age in place. And increasingly, middle-income residents are feeling shut out of opportunities that previous generations took for granted. I'm going to quickly go over a little bit of the housing stuff, but the data tells a clear story. According to a 2025 state report that he mentioned, Massachusetts needs to build approximately 222,000 new homes by 2035 just to meet existing demand. That means that we have to produce 22,000 homes per year, a pace that we are nowhere near, achieving. In fact, the Commonwealth's housing production has slowed dramatically over time. Last month, the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce released a report that showed from 1960 to 1979, Massachusetts permitted roughly, 30,000 housing units annually. And then between 2000 and 2019, that number fell to 16,000 units annually. At the same time, costs have surged. The Chamber report notes that Massachusetts has a median home price of about $665,000 compared to the national median average of $419,000. These challenges are not occurring in a vacuum. Mark talked about our competitor states. So other states are competing with us for residents, workers, and employers. The report found that Massachusetts lags competing states in housing production, multifamily housing permitting, rental availability, and affordability. So we're losing residents to states like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, places where housing is generally more abundant and more affordable. That is the reality of the housing market today, but importantly, Massachusetts has taken some meaningful steps to address this crisis. So starting off with MBTA Communities Act, this is one of the most significant reforms in recent years, and it was adopted in 2021. And the law requires that communities that are served by the MBTA to zone for multifamily housing by right near transit at reasonable densities and without any age restrictions. And the early results show that the policy is working. According to Boston Indicators, in January 2026, more than 100 housing projects totaling nearly 7,000 homes is already in the permitting, construction, or occupancy pipeline. In the nearly 6 months since then, an additional 2,000 units have come onto that pipeline. These are projects that in most cases would not have been possible without this law. So this is a real, if modest, increase in multifamily housing production. Importantly, the law did also advance one of the most crucial reforms on housing policy, and that is by right multifamily zoning. The MBTA communities has been the most effective state policy in decades to advance by right multifamily zoning. This matters because predictability matters. When housing projects require years of discretionary approvals, repeated hearings, uncertain planning timelines, projects just become more expensive, riskier to finance, and harder to build. By right zoning reduces uncertainty and lowers those barriers to production. Another important takeaway from the report is, how much of this new construction is not new high-rise developments. While they do only make up 6% of the total number of units, more than half of the projects in the pipeline contain fewer than 30 units. So these are the kind of missing middle housing types like duplexes, townhomes, triple deckers, modest multifamily units that historically formed the backbone of many Massachusetts communities. The law also encourages more transit-oriented growth patterns. So many of these projects are being developed in walkable downtowns, mixed-use centers, near bus routes, rail trails, and train stations. That means creating housing in places where residents actually can rely less on their cars and where communities can grow more sustainably. At the same time, the report is candid that the MBTA communities alone will not solve our housing shortage. Even if all of the currently proposed units are built, that only accounts for an overall increase. The overall increase would still amount to less than 1% of the total housing stock within MBTA communities. So the law represents an important shift in the direction, but it is also proof that statewide zoning reform can work. Another really big thing that happened is the legalization of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. So this was part of the Affordable Homes Act in 2024. ADUs became legal statewide starting February 2025. These are smaller homes located on the same lot as existing residents, so basement apartments, garage conversions, or backyard ADUs. And again, the impact was really immediate. According to a report released by Boston Indicators and Abundant Housing last month, municipalities in the last year received 1,600 applications for ADUs and permitted more than 1,200 permits alone. That's a higher take-up rate than when California legalized ADUs statewide out there. So this is a clear increase over prior years. Perhaps the most important lesson from this is that state-level legalization does work. So the report notes that statewide zoning reform accomplished more in 1 year than decades of municipality by municipality reforms. And ADUs are important because they create flexible housing opportunities that fit naturally into existing neighborhoods. They can provide housing for aging parents, adult children, caregivers, or renters. They can also generate income for homeowners, and they can create relatively lower cost housing opportunities without dramatically changing neighborhood character. I've heard many times, ADU can cost $250,000, $300,000. I do challenge you to find a 2-bedroom house that you can build for under $200,000 anywhere else in the state. So it is expensive, but it is less expensive relatively. But the ADU report does highlight, an important truth about housing policy more broadly, and that a zoning reform alone is not enough. We heard this question before, but the report outlines how fragmented permitting system, overlapping regulations, inconsistent local requirements, and outdated processes continue to create costs and delays. Even after legalization, many homeowners still face complicated approval pathways, including, involving septic rules, home or wetland regulations, energy codes, fire codes, and local review processes, that dramatic variably, from one municipality to another. The message I hope to deliver today was that Massachusetts has begun to address this crisis, but we still have substantial work ahead of us. That means supporting practical zoning and land use reforms that reduce unnecessary barriers, expand multifamily housing opportunities, and allow responsible development to move forward more efficiently. The reality is clear. We cannot solve a supply crisis without building more homes. As highlighted by the 3 reports I reviewed, one of the biggest challenges facing housing production today is the inconsistent patchwork of local regulations from one municipality to another. Right now, as a specific example, site plan review is not something that's defined by Commonwealth law, and it's something that every municipality develops individually on its own. So, Every community has, created these uncertainties and delays, and, it just adds to the rising costs for housing projects that would already be permitted under that local zoning. These inconsistent rules discourage investment and make it harder to deliver the communities the housing that they deserve. Establishing clear statewide standards and timelines for site plan review would create a more predictable process while also still preserving, appropriate local oversight and input. Uniform zoning and permitting is not about taking away local control. It's about creating fairness, transparency, and consistency across the entire state. Communities would still be able to address legitimate concerns like traffic, drainage, and public safety, but without the vague or shifting requirements that can still, stall projects and create that uncertainty. A more uniform framework would reduce development risk, lower costs, and encourage the responsible production of new housing. At a time when nearly 80% of Massachusetts households cannot afford a median-priced home, we need policies that make it easier, not harder, to build the housing that we need. The good news is that we're no longer, debating whether there is a problem in Massachusetts. The Commonwealth has begun moving in the right direction. The MBTA Communities Act has demonstrated that statewide zoning can unlock housing production, and ADU legalization has shown that when barriers are removed, homeowners and builders respond immediately. Now we need the urgency and the political will to build on that momentum. At the Massachusetts Association of Realtors, we believe that the solution is not one single housing policy or one single housing type. It is about a comprehensive approach: zoning reform, streamlined permitting, infrastructure investment, and a commitment from the state and local leaders alike to say more, yes to more housing. So ultimately, every home we build is an opportunity for someone to stay in Massachusetts, raise a family here, retire here, or pursue the opportunities that make this Commonwealth special.
I want to thank you all for being here. I know you have really busy schedules, and it matters. So very happy that you could join us today. I also would like to thank Dr. Mark Melnik. I would like to thank Coleman for being here as well. All of our sponsors. So again, Cross Country, the Marquee team, Summer, Dwyer Colways, Titan Insurance, and Boston Home Inspectors. Without you, we couldn't be here. And I have one more person to thank and team in the room. I'd like Jason to stand front room. Being sent to all in this room and putting this together. So thank you so much.